started actually in 2010 and 2011 when the first sets of public consultations took place. At that stage, the Environmental Management Act was not yet law. So this project actually predates, the start of this project predates when the Environmental Management Act came into being. And so the procedures for EIAs were not as thoroughly set out and people were not as familiar with them then as they are now. Then public interest in the project started to expand and people started to get concerned what was happening. And so what they did was they went to Google to see what Google had to say about phosphate mining. Every phosphate mine in the world is different, but at the top of the Google list was the mining activities that were proposed in New Zealand for phosphate mining. And the situation there is profoundly different to the situation here in Namibia. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But essentially, the concerns that were raised and the legitimate concerns that were raised in the case of New Zealand were carried across into this Namibian project and got everyone very concerned about what was happening here. Yes, in New Zealand, the phosphates are contained in nodules, essentially rocks on the sea floor. So the sea floor has all these little boulders and rocks which contain the phosphate. And those boulders and rocks support a really important and interesting coral and sponge community. And that sponge and coral community in turn supports a huge number of invertebrates and fishes, and the whole sort of ecosystem is dependent on that. So you take away these phosphate nodules, these rocks, these little boulders, and you mine them out of the system, you've actually destroyed the substrate of the system, that unique cold water coral and sponge ecosystem. You've essentially destroyed it. In Namibia, the phosphate occurs essentially in sand particles, contained within sand particles. And this is a huge uniform seabed with these sand particles containing phosphate. So what you're doing is lifting up the sand particles, you're dredging with vacuum dredgers, the sand particles on board, and you're taking those particles to shore and you're processing them on shore. Now, as you dredge, the seabed is moving and the high energy oceans are moving the sediments all the time, and they will smooth off. And the basic benthic sea life in the adjacent areas will start to recolonize the area which has been dredged. Well, I have pondered hard on why there was such strong resistance from the fishing sector to phosphate mining, where anyone who studied the reports, who understood the science, who understood the external evaluation of the reports, could see that the impact on the marine ecosystem and on the fishing sector was so very, very small to be insignificant. Why was there the strong resistance and the strong kickback against phosphate mining? In the case of the private sector and the unions, I think it was largely because the reports were inaccessible, not just physically inaccessible, but the science behind them. You need to be a scientist really to read those reports and understand what they were saying. And I think the populist sentiment in the public that arose from the misinformation and so on, that carried over into the commercial fishing sector and into the unions, and they assumed that what people were saying was right and that they should be concerned and they needed to respond. But the thing that that was more confusing and difficult to understand was why was the fishing Ministry of Fisheries with its scientists, why were they so opposed to the sector? And I think my conclusion was that from the very top of the ministry, this was a territorial battle. Rights over the marine ecosystem, command and control over the sea and everything in it above and below ground and water, and it was simply a territorial control thing by that ministry at the time. So we very much hope that we will start seeing a change in attitudes from that ministry, led from the top down, and we will have a more balanced and appropriate response to embracing all forms of appropriate, sustainable development in the sector. At the moment, we have no evidence that phosphate mining, if carried out in the right way and at the right scale, we have no evidence that it will be detrimental to the marine ecosystem or to the fishing sector. I think by becoming really transparent, having independent monitoring mechanisms in place, an independent steering committee, we can get around a lot of the apprehension and the concerns that have been raised to date because of the lack of information and the correct information being imported from other parts of the world where the mining situation, phosphate situation is entirely different.